Aren't they? You're listening. Oh, good, good.
I just got a message, don't start the revolution without.
Don't start the revolution without me. Who said that?
Exactly. So I was the movers.
Be reminded this tiny little group, and this may be a foreshadowing in the future. We got, this is October, we got November, December, January. We're on past payment of this room. After that, before we continue to meet in this church, we got to come up with some more money in February. By January, we will have done World War I and the 20s. And that may be enough. You say, well, I know the rest of the World War II. And then we can even talk about what if anything more to that. So let this discussion come down the road. For the time being, it's the dramatic moment in Western history. Next time, if you want to come back, the Industrial Revolution. Whenever I taught this in AP, your class, I would always do chapter 20 first, the Industrial Revolution, and then do the French Revolution in chapter 23 back to back, because they dovetail into each other so well. You'll see if you want to read these two chapters or something similar. The Industrial Revolution is, of course, fascinating, but there's not as much discussion of all the ideologies and debates about the future and caste and that kind of stuff. This is chapter 21 of the French Revolution, and then you pick back up here. But they go together. So that's November 3rd, if you wish. If you looked at any of the two chapters of the French Revolution, there's a bunch of social history that is actually quite substantial and important. And so I wanted to review just a little bit of it in a tiny little way. In general, by the time you get to 1730, 1740, there is this general feeling among the masses of Europe, particularly the French, and particularly the French urban masses, which were not a substantial part of France fair, but still significant in terms of moving things along. The things were changing, and something was going on that was hard to understand. Europe-wide, there were some real interesting things happening. A population explosion and rural enclosure movements, which you may or may not have read about. The growth of cottage industry, rapid erosion of social norms, that sounds familiar. And this conflict, this has been introduced several times. I think it's good. Instead of just talking about the Enlightenment as driving the French Revolution forward, there was this other side of the story, these great awakenings, these returns to real fundamental religion that was going on at the same time. And then the success of the American War of Independence was significant. And you know that many textbooks tend to say the American War of Independence, rather than the Revolutionary War. There was a debate about whether it was a revolution or not, whatever. In France, in particular, there were these things going on. We just review those as we go through. Population. It was one of those moments where it started. You remember back, if you've been through this before, you can remember being through it before. There was this substantial population growth from about 10,000 to 1,300. Weather got better, crops got better, this and that. So they came to play. And then, well, there was a general population growth for a while, and then a cold spell. The real takeoff is about 1,700. And if you look at that graph from 1,700 to 1900 to 2000, it's just an explosive growth. That's the graph from the textbook from England. If you do Europe in general, same idea. A real steady growth in population. Why was that? Well, here's another chart to show that it's not even in all countries. And this is rather interesting. Yeah, France was for a long time the most popular country in Europe. But by 1775, Russia has passed, and Russia will go on to be much more populous by the time you get to the 20th century. For all sorts of one reason that happened was because weather got warm. I mean, if this is the average temperatures warm and cold for a long period of time, there were periods of up and down. This is the natural cycles for all sorts of interesting reasons. Less to do with coal burning than it is now, but you get a real warming trend. for quite a while, and keep it an incredibly fast warming trend, which will, of course, increase the growing season. So one reason why this population explosion is agriculture, a combination of what science and then some pretty nasty decisions about farmland. The local, of course, is the population, the growing population. Growing season just got so much longer because of warming climate. Science, this you get a lot of this, frankly, in the French Revolution, in the Industrial Revolution chapter. That all sorts of science being applied to agriculture in the first time, primarily first at least in the Netherlands. William Mary carried it on to England. It was eventually copied. I mean, the understanding of the nitrogen. People didn't know about nitrogen yet, but they knew that these crops produced more nitrogen soils. You actually collected the cow manure, you put it on the fields, draining swamps, water meadows, instead of letting it freeze during the season, during the winter, flood them with water, and the crops would continue to grow, especially things like turnips. And then there was this ugly thing that profits over community, the so-called enclosure movement. I think there's a graphic. Oh no. Students love the graphic. You couldn't put that in enough times. But there was this selective breeding, and this selective breeding probably didn't produce cows quite that big, but they're eating turnips, which is a new crop. Enclosure movement. What's that? Picture in the 1700s of a typical farm village in England. All those shaded lands are the common lands, where anyone could farm them. And if the common lands were also forested, peasants could not go in there and hunt, nor could they go in and chop down trees, but they could get wood. You get to the 1700s, middle 1700s, and legislation is passed primarily in Britain, but also in France and other places. The people that own that land, the lords, are able to enclose it, put fences around it until the common people they can use it. And if you can't use it anymore, you got a problem, because you depend on that land to grow crops. So there, it is certainly more efficient to farm with farming techniques that are going to produce more food than this. But on the other hand, it produces a real social crisis for people that use the land. Another thing, and this is obviously mentioned, but the Columbian Exchange, this enormous transfer of some crops that were not native to the New World, that come to the New World and back. And potato in particular, but lots of other things that are going to produce more food during winter. Potatoes in particular, they can store for 2 or 3 years. Maybe a little rotten after 3 years, people still eat them and survive.
So one disease that went from the New World to the Old World was syphilis.
Yeah.
And it was an acute disease when it first hit the Old World.
Yeah. One of the least important explanations for why population grew in this period of time was that medical science got so much better. It did get better, but not a whole lot better on models. It would get better down the road when people understood that there were such things as bacteria. And they were still in the 1750s, 1770s, still doing bloodletting. And it finally did get this breakthrough with Jenner producing smallpox vaccination in England. I think it was in the textbook, right? You read this. One of his friends was a woman whose husband was an ambassador in Istanbul, and witnessed it in Istanbul and brought it back and told Jenner and said, "What about this?" And it had been going on in India for 300 years.
Well, it was a little bit different than Jenner actually made the connection with small cowpox. What had been going on in China since the 1400s was virilization, where they actually took live smallpox, real smallpox, and put it in the superficial skin. And then it was a race between smallpox and the immune system. And 15% of people died from it, including almost one of John and Abigail's children. There was a big wrenching decision for them, and they decided to do virilization. And one of the five got very sick. At least it was dramatized that way in the HBO John Adams series. The Laura Lee playing.
So it was a lot. So it was starting. It was starting, but it would take it won't be the next. It won't be November, but December. There's a lot of where the germ theory finally becomes understandable, and it's not just that we know that the germs are germ. You've got mass production of clean steel for carrying waste away. So real production of if it's true that population explosion does create a bit of social unrest, I think you all know this, but it's always useful to talk about how unbelievably dramatic it is. I mean, in this 100-year period, if you start in 1920 and go to 2020, the population of the world doubles twice. That had never happened in human history, and it will never happen again. It's just not conceivable that that will happen again. And so an awful lot of what we take for granted is not to be taken for granted, because it's under circumstances of astonishing human population growth, which produces all sorts of consequences and reactions of this type. So, but that would be that another way. Cottage industry. This is just what it sounds. We had no industrial plants in the cities yet because the steam engine had not been perfected yet. And frankly, the whole idea of mechanized factories, even where there's full water power, hadn't been invented quite yet. But in the 1700s, there is this population explosion. There are more people to consume. And the entrepreneurs of the world say, well, I'm going to buy up bags of wool. I'm going to take out the countryside. I'm going to find cottages where people are willing to contract, turn that wool into sweaters, socks, whatever the hell. And I'll come back in 3 months and I know they produced it. Well, of course, the quality was out. These workers could say, I changed my mind. I didn't want to do it anyway. It wasn't very good. But it did produce a source of work and a source of profits for both the entrepreneur who would bring the cotton or whatever, the leather for shoes, and the farmer in the countryside or the farmer's wife that would actually turn this stuff out. It didn't last terribly long because it was so bloody inefficient. But this was one of the causes of real interesting social change. One of those was young people could now, since there was land enclosed, the land that the parents and grandparents had depended on to graze the sheep on the common land, and the village was no longer available. They were sort of shut out of the house only because there wasn't enough wealth to keep that number of people fed and clothed anyway. And now there's the possibility of a young 15, 16-year-old couple going out there and establishing their own little household and setting up a cottage industry. And of course, the other side of that happens too. You're 16, 17 years old, having kids, you're not ready for it. So there's a lot more early marriage and a lot more kids that are born illegitimate. And the numbers, as you read this, are really rather staggering. I mean, Bordeaux, 36% of all the babies. There weren't many places that kept these kinds of records. You know, in Paris, what's the number here? Something like 50% of the babies, or 1/3, were being given up to the so-called pounding hospitals. That is, here's a rotating door, a Lady Susan, you can put your newborn child in there, turn it, and hope that there's someone on the other side. Good. What wonderful thing. Churches and other places at least tried, or of course it didn't work that well. They weren't responding very well anyway. And the heartbreak that comes with that, and the confusion was leading to some real breakdown of social norms that have been around for a while. And they maintain a certain sense of stability. Oh, again, some of you are all familiar with it. It's rather wrenching song from Les Mis, yeah? Where the woman who was going to give birth to the child Cosette, that's what was the situation. Les Mis, by the way, was not the French Revolution. That was 1830s, but whatever, they might be. And even if those kids that were given up would survive and they were orphans, then what? They would be farmed off to do crappy labor somewhere as soon as usually in the countryside, often abused. A lot of bad stuff. Not that that was new in the world, but there was more of it with population explosion. So solutions. There was a general sense of anxiety among many masses that things are not going well, and what's the old order is falling apart, and we don't know what's happening, but it's not doing us very good. And when that perception happens, revolution is a possibility. What were the possible solutions? One came from the church, from the Great Awakening, and that depended on where you're talking about, a Protestant church or a Catholic church. Really rather different. Similar in the sense that we're here for you. We know that there's problems. We've got an answer for you, but the answer is going to be somewhat different. So you've got this rather famous first Great Awakening. The most famous will be the second Great Awakening in the United States. But in Europe, it's the first Great Awakening, where you have a set of people like John Wesley in England who will ride some enormous number of miles, who ain't giving outdoor speeches in tents and this and that sort of revival meetings, essentially. And the message is, the old church is indeed corrupt. You should listen to what I have to say. And by the way, you should be donating to my cause. But I want you to feel reborn. You should feel Christ in your life. You need to read the Bible. This sounds awfully familiar because we're in the fourth iteration of this in the United States. In the United States, the most famous guy by far was John Edwards. And his message was quite severe. God is angry as to me. You're all sinners. You can repent, but you got to come to me. You got to you got to feel it in your heart, and this and that, and so forth. This would dissipate with the Revolutionary War and come back a bit later. If it's Catholic, it was a somewhat different message because you didn't want to badmouth the traditional church because you were the traditional church. What you did tend to say as a Catholic, if you were on the side of the masses suffering, yes, it's true. These damn Catholic Jesuits they've gone too far, they've become less than Catholic, like Richelieu in France. And so you have a reason to be upset about that. And yes, all this commerce, profit above morality is a problem. The modern life is a problem. So we as a church need to address these needs, and the way we'd like to address them is have more fun, so have more festivals, more the carnival can be even more fun. And by the way, when you come to church, we have gorgeous stories for this. You go to those Protestant churches, they're so bare and music, and it was different reactions for what it's worth. If you've not been exposed to this before, most historians will say we are almost certainly in the midst of a fourth Great Awakening. It comes back periodically as America goes through one social crisis after another. This is an enormous big deal, the second Great Awakening, which will lead to all sorts of interesting things, including the attempt to get rid of slavery. But that's American history. The intellectuals offered different solutions other than getting the Bible and come back to Jesus and so forth. It was rather a whole different set of solutions if you were in an enlightenment, educated human being. Whatever. But here's the solution. We want people to get better educated. You should read science and get involved and participate in debate. And if we just figure out the natural laws of politics and society, it worked in physics. We've got no law of gravity. It worked in navigation. We've got so if there's natural laws for physics, there are going to be natural laws for these things too. The closer we get to them by using our reason and experimentation and openness to change, the closer we'll get to having a better political, economic, social system. So get involved. And this should sound familiar too. If you send your kids off to college, in theory, this part of the reason to multiply at school. And religion, they said there's nothing wrong with religion. We're not good at my religion, but don't take it too literally. Most of these guys were so-called deists. as was watched on all our founding fathers, almost universally. And the deist, what was the deist attitude toward God? Well, yeah, there's a God. God made, he's like a clockmaker, made the universe, set it in motion, all these natural rules that are there to be discovered for a reason. But God doesn't interfere in it. That makes no sense. So the idea of praying to God to change things is really odd. The encyclopedia was published, the first ever French tome. The intent to put in volumes all that was known, so that someone that could afford to buy the encyclopedia could read A through Z and know a lot of stuff, famous sort of stuff. And what was it? What was the response? Put together and discuss things, debate, read stuff. This would have been a typical salon in France. And this is an American hanging out with his friends. Like, that's Ben Franklin, who was beloved. He could, if you got Benjamin Franklin to your salon, you were guaranteed to have a good crowd come and debate. And our founding fathers were part of this whole scene of talking about this stuff. So if you were an enlightenment maker, what was it that you wanted to promote as new virtues, as a way to solve the social chaos? These two liberty and law. What was liberty? These are things the government could not take away from you. You should have the natural law to have it, things that you wouldn't do with this from the First Amendment rights, including other amendments that go down in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. All this stuff about not being, have to testify against the Fifth Amendment, blah, blah, blah. You shouldn't be forced to be abused because people have power. And there's always this interesting concept that power rests in the people. This is vague. It's actually fairly vague if you dig a little deep at it, but you say that and it sounds convincing. But the point of saying that was it does not invest in an inherited king. Well, where is it? Well, it's in the people. They get to make their own rules. Equality, the literal view of equality, that you could not get a job or a wife or get into college or do any other thing because of the luck of birth or the luck of wealth or the luck of religion or the choice of religion. As any textbook would say, no mention yet of gender, no mention yet of ethnicity, that would come later, but at least you're getting started on this stuff. The economic equality, as any textbook would mention, for a liberal point of view, is not that you're going to end up with equality at the end of competition, but at the beginning of your life, everything should start off even. And good luck. And you say, well, that's an interesting proposition, but are you kidding me? How are you going to do that? Which makes the whole proposition a little odd, again, but whatever. And having mentioned that, this is John the people who had kids that I thought were was as time passed and the age got longer, it became traditional here for 20 kids in class to be assigned to write down Mr. Nelson's most obnoxious quotes to be published in the year, so his wife would fear about the lose the show. Stuff like this. Whatever. The kids thought this was fun. It's not funny. It's just pathetic. Move on. I mean, it was 15 to 16 years old. So move on. No, there was 10 or 7 of them. I got these kids from taking notes and I write this stuff down. Lord. Just to go back to something that's been done way many times. You've been hanging in maybe standing up here for too many years. What did Adam Smith actually say about market price? These you can go if you can go to somewhere and get a copy of the Wealth of Nations. Go to page 72 and 73, and you'll see quotes that say this stuff. He said, what I want is the natural price of goods. I don't want the market price. The market price is very often way much higher than the price that I want. All the market price is what you actually sell it for. And scumballs who have privilege and can have a monopoly will charge way too much. I don't like market price. I want a natural price. But I can't determine the natural price. I'm just going to define it. And what he defined natural price as was pretty much what's written there. A price that fully compensates the producer for everything that was necessary to get the thing produced and allows that producer to live within the range of average community standards. He was not talking about whatever you get away with is just fine. And he said, what I want is for somehow to get a system that the market price gets closer and closer to the natural price, as close as I can get it. And then I can sort of live with the market price. And the key to that would be there'd be no barriers to supply and demand. Anyone can get what they need, or at least there's no artificial barrier put up so that the people with privilege get the supply. And no barrier to entering into competition to produce whatever it is you want to produce. There's total free competition and freedom of supply to the degree that there's enough to go around. And then secondarily, that all producers and consumers have an equal opportunity and equal knowledge of all the conditions. Well, once again, that's really sweet. That's a nice idea. But are you kidding me? And yeah, if you start heading in that direction, it will get slightly better. But that's never going to apply. So, but the notion that he was for a free market, regardless of, and no regulation of artists, it's just nonsense. So he's been, just like Karl Marx said, taken and sort of abused. This is more actual question. Okay, get that off my chest. Here's another, and this is of some interest to me. We were in New Zealand, and the guy who was staying with said, read this book. And I said, well, 300 pages for here today. I can't read it. But I'll read the introduction. And what the guy says, look, if you look at 1770s, 1790s, 1800s, and read about revolutions, this was all the talk. Liberty, equality, liberty, equality. In about 100 later, you're you have countries like New Zealand and Canada and so forth that were gaining independence about that. And their discussions in their founding was all about fairness. Liberty and equality were not irrelevant, but they weren't top of the list. And just to drive that point home a little bit, you've seen this before. Some of you have seen it before. Now 10 years old, but remember this interesting, fantastically interesting experiment when these Harvard and Duke guys, the sociologists and economists went out and gathered a huge number of people in their sample, equal number of men and women, old, poor, rich, or young, Republican, Democrats, and so forth, and said, all right, imagine the richest 20%, the next 20%, all the way down to the bottom 20% in terms of wealth in the United States. What do you think would be fair? A fair distribution of wealth among those different 20%. And of course, no one said perfectly, well, someone probably did. But the average was that, not equal. And this is a concept of fairness, that the top 20% should maybe have 30% of the wealth, the bottom 20%, maybe 10, split more or less. The second question was, what do you think it is? And pretty much most Americans said, yeah, I know it's not quite what it ought to be. That's disturbing. It's not fair. And of course, then that was revealed what it actually was. And this has gotten worse. This has gotten worse since that.
What year was that?
2011. 10 years ago. And everyone knows Biden's not going to get 3.5 billion passed. Maybe nothing. Trillion. So what?
No difference.
So what? No difference.
That's the point.
I mean, you can find it in Bermuda tomorrow. You can find it in South Dakota tomorrow. It's we know very well where that stuff is. In any case, so to make the point, these debates, the show of the French Revolution, this is still it. It's still the same thing. It hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot ever since. And it's probably now kind of past time this debate means much anymore. In any case, back then, when enlightenment thinkers, no matter how sincere, came up with these ideas, a lot of peasants or urban workers said, I'm not sure I'm really with you on this kind of stuff. One, the liberties that many were talking about were freedom of speech, freedom of, that doesn't mean anything to me. Where's the price of bread? And a lot of these guys said, I'm opposed to a lot of this stuff. For example, the freedom of an entrepreneur to enclose his land and kick me off it, even though it's been traditional for me to graze my sheep. I'm not for that freedom. It may be more efficient agriculture, but I'm not interested in efficiency. And the freedom that an employer has to not have to fight a labor union, I'm not for that. I want a labor union. The freedom, the market freedom that no government can set a bread price. They say, I'm not for that. I want governments to set a bread price. That's that, or I starve. And the freedom to practice religion say, heck no, I'm for the Catholic religion. I'm not for all this freedom stuff. But in any case, everyone was not there with the liberal, and that was the case in the United States. An awful lot of people, way less than half of the United States, when the Revolutionary War came, were on board with it. At least 20% just went back to England, and the other 40% said, I don't trust these rich guys anyway. So another effect of the French Revolution was that the War of Independence actually was successful. Whether it really was a liberal revolution or not until the Civil War, who knows? That's an interesting historical debate in American history. But in any case, it had succeeded. So that was proof that something about it could change. And boy, did it train a whole lot of people that had experienced it, that this could happen. And Thomas Paine, for example, was disgusted with what happened with the American Revolution and went off to France to say, I want to see what happens when a real revolution occurs. And a lot of the other questions.
He's up in prison and almost lost his head.
Yeah, true. That's exactly right. There was some real problems with going back to France at that stage. So specific things that were going on in France, we're going to lead directly to the French Revolution, despite this. Louis XV France wasn't broke, but it was on the verge of being broke. It had fought way too many wars. That's built up. The most recent war had been the 7 Years' War, which we know as the French and Indian War. There just wasn't enough money to take care of all the needs that the French king should take care of to keep the so-called richest country in France functioning, and in Europe functioning very well. So he tried to impose a 5% income tax on everybody. And the first and second estate said, no, it's part of our deal. That's what nobles and clergy do not get taxed. The first estate, the so-called clergy, in purple, and the aristocracy riding on the back of the third estate. This is only 0.5% of all of French population, only 10% of the land. But no, you're not legally able to collect taxes, and we're not paying it. The nobles, only 1.5% of the total population, only 25% of the land, also said so that was enough problems for Louis XV. But on the other side, he was a problem, personally. And this majesty that had built up about the Bourbon kings, from Henry IV to Louis XIII to Louis XIV, more than 100 years, simply backwards, because he was a real philanderer. And there was an awful lot of scandal mongering, some of it not honest, but it was typical of what was going on at this time. You were free to say what you could about the King of France, whereas in another generation, you wouldn't have done that, or you wouldn't have been free to publish it. And you get then to Louis XVI, his head's going to roll, and he's just kind of a mess. He's not designed to be a king. He wants to be loved and ruled. He tries the same thing. He can't do it. He can't form a national bank. The national bank, there's a tremendous advantage of having a national bank. You're in debt, just print money. Now, there's a problem with printing money. The rich hate it because they expect to get real money back, but you can get out of debt fairly fast. as a government by printing money. And France has tended to do that over its 5 republics, whereas Britain never has. And one could ask, and it is a question that's asked in European history for 20 years and still does, which is the more equal side, France or Britain? And Thomas Piketty would give you an answer that will lead. All right, so he's got a problem. And it's even worse now because the French have paid for the American War of Independence. That's actually, without that, we would never in the world become independent. I mean, the Battle of Saratoga, we're only halfway through it. But the amount of money that France has donated to get to the Battle of Saratoga, 90% of the American troops are carrying French arms. You get something like 12,000 soldiers in the rebellion, 22,000 naval personnel helping blockade British stuff. No, we could have never gotten it. Of course, it's in France's interest for the British to lose. But so they're broke, and you got 20% of all the money that's coming in is going to go for productive functions. He has no choice. He has no choice but to call the States General, which the Bourbon King said, "I want to call these guys. It's our tradition." Way back then, when it was the Middle Ages, we would call the clergy and the representatives of the clergy, representatives of the nobility, representatives of the so-called common people. That is 97% of us. They come in, we'd ask to raise taxes. We'd have to give a good idea, but we haven't done that. They're called. You got this on May 5th. They all assemble, and pretty soon there's a rancorous debate of how are we going to vote? Is it each estate gets one vote? So the clergy and the nobility get to outvote the third estate, or we're going to divide up the vote in somewhat more equitable fashion. And of course, the first and second estate, not universally, but to a large degree, say, well, it's going to be 3 votes. And then the revolution starts. It's the first phase. It'll be 4 phases. The third estate runs off to the indoor tennis courts because it's another convenient place to be, and swears the tennis court oath, saying we're not leaving until we have a constitution, and it will be a liberal constitution. And whether we can get it to stand or not is another issue, but we're not leaving until we have a constitution. And in this famous painting, there are clergy that come over, and there are aristocrats that come over who are part of the Enlightenment and say, we're with you. And as the textbook says, this is research done in the last 20 years. It's really rather powerful. And some of the opposite happened. There were some rich businessmen in the so-called third estate, even though they were richer than most nobles, who said, yeah, I'm going to go over with the second estate. I would like to be a noble person. And with my wealth and the old way of doing things, I could buy a noble title next week. And so I don't want this revolution to happen. It wasn't as if it was the clergy and the nobility against everybody else. It was much more complicated and mixed up. Poor old Louis doesn't know what he's doing. One of his wives said, bring in troops. He orders 18,000 troops to Versailles. They haven't gotten there yet, but he's ordered them. And at that moment, the Paris mob takes over from first of 5 or 6 or 7 times. They will run the revolution without them. And this is a mob, if you go back for the first 20 minutes, that is confused and unhappy, and they've taken their newly born children to founding hospitals. They know life's not going well, and life is really a mess now. For 2 years, they've had terrible harvests. The bread prices are going through the roof. And they know what's going on in Versailles, 14 miles away. And they say either troops are going to come in, we've got to get weapons of our own, we got to go to the Bastille. There's no hardly any prisoners. They go to the Bastille to get weapons. And it's successful because there's hardly anybody to defend the thing. Luckily, somebody gathers Lafayette, who's back from the United States from the war, and says, "Look, would you kind of be in charge of these things? Things get really crazy here, and just sort of provide some order here." So the weapons are taken back down to Versailles to say we will protect the people in the tennis court from being overwhelmed by the king's troops. Some of you know this. Here's the keys to the Bastille. what happens, what's the eventual fate of the keys to the Bastille?
No idea.
It's fascinating. You may have seen them, you may not have known.
Really?
But if you ever go to Mount Vernon, you walk into the Mount Vernon tour, you walk in the front door and turn left, and there's the key to the Bastille.
Serious. Really?
Lafayette said it to Washington. Said, here's for your friendship, here's the keys to the Bastille. Whatever. So the revolution is on, and out, the rumors spread out in the countryside. Peasants hear incorrectly or fear incorrectly that the king is going to send troops and the noblemen are going to send troops, as they always have in the past. This would hardly be a new thing. It had always happened. It's a periodic peasant revolution or peasant revolts against misery. They'd always be destroyed. So they said, this time we attack first. And of course, it was a fairly easy counterattack because there really wasn't any plan out here by the nobles. And they'll burn buildings, they'll kill people. When they find documents that say, this is what you owe us in taxes, this is what you owe us. You owe us 2 months every year to work on our roads for no pay. They just burned all those old feudal documents and occupied lands. And then the people sitting back there in the French, in the tennis court said, what do we do about all this? And there's a moment, quite famous in French history, August 4th, where one by one, the nobles and the clergy that had come over to the third estate get up and renounce all the stuff. Feudalism should be eliminated. We should get rid of it. Feudalism is over. No more serfdom. No more exclusive hunting rights for nobles, blah, blah, blah. There's medallions cast for that very moment. And as the textbook says, and every textbook says this, from that moment forward, the French peasants are not in revolutionary force much anymore. They've gotten what they wanted. They've gotten land. It's not, you can't call it land reform because it wasn't given to them. They took it. But once they took it, these guys said, well, they can have it. We're going to confirm that what has happened is now legal. And as long as that stays that way, and no one's going to come out here with a counter-revolution and take their land back, the peasants are not terribly interested in all the liberty and equality stuff that the Enlightenment was. So you're still sitting here with the National Assembly trying to figure out what's going to do. It declares the Declaration of Rights of Man. This is somewhat parallel to our Declaration of Independence, but a little bit more grandiose. I mean, you've got this graphic that looks exactly like the Ten Commandments would be. This is supposed to be the Ten Commandments. Human beings are born equal. We know the vocabulary to some degree, but some of it is different from ours. Social distinctions can only be found on what you're worth, not birth. And there's a whole list here. You can go read this stuff if there's time. There's never time enough to do all that stuff. But I did want to underline a couple of these phrases in Article 3 and Article 6, and they continue on. The nation, the general will. There is in this document of the University of Human Rights, in the French version, it's what the nation needs. It's not what you as the individual decide. And that's really rather different from our Declaration of Independence, where it's freedom of choice. We do what we want. Like it, take it or leave it. That's been the French idea. It comes from Rousseau primarily. No, it comes from a lot of places, but Rousseau tends to be the most renowned of the promoters of this idea, the general will, and his terminology is put right into the article. So that exists, but of course that's all it is a piece of paper. Meanwhile, the Constitution, the debate over what the Constitution is going to look like is stalled, which wouldn't be terribly surprising because it was almost exactly the same time. It's not unbelievable. What was the year in which we were sitting around, our guys were sitting around in Philadelphia debating the Constitution? It was 87, for God's sake. That was 89 and it's ratified. So it's really uncanny that the years are so parallel. So they're debating with the Constitution.
They're so close. They're trading people.
They are trading people. The trading is, it takes 30 days to get across. And so once again, the Paris mob takes over. This time it's mostly women. And they march down to the Versailles and frustrated, where the president, it's October now, fall is coming. And they're ready to kill the royal family and would probably have done so. They do kill others. Lafayette, you can't, this is a terrible graphic. Lafayette is renowned for going up and taking Marie Antoinette's hand and kissing her hand and sort of demonstrating to the crowd below that, look, we can't get too crazy here. Let's just capture them and take them back to Paris, and we don't have to kill them quite yet. From the role of Lafayette in this whole thing is fascinating. And of course, you can see this. You got more to say because you read Lafayette. I mean, Lafayette. When the American Revolution starts, Lafayette is the head of the fourth richest family in France. By the time the French Revolution is over, he's penniless. He's lost his entire fortune. He's been in jail for 7 or so years. It's a pretty impressive story in some ways. Whatever. So the royal families march back to Paris, and they're put in the palace it doesn't exist anymore. It will eventually burn down. The Louvre next door doesn't burn down, and they're basically prisoners. And now the National Assembly does a dicey thing, probably a mistake. They will seize the church lands. Now it makes sense that they do, because they need someone. They're going to found the National Bank. And if you're going to found the National Bank, someone's going to invest money in the National Bank of France, or it's got no money. So what's the collateral for the money that you invest in the National Bank? The church lands that you just seized. So that made some sort of sense. But the peasants out there, who are the majority of France, are not happy with all that. And it gets even worse when the National Assembly says you got to take an oath to the France, and half the priests won't. This graphic is forget the graphic. So this nothing will be. It remains still today an issue in modern France, less and less by every decade, but it is still a bit of an issue. The Pope fought back, and a lot of common people, peasants said, I don't agree with all this, and this gap opened up. This should sound somewhat familiar, which is still there in France today. It got horrendous in by the 1900s. At the end of the 19th century, early 1900s. It's closed a little bit, but there is a substantial gap over religion, this other kind of stuff. A mistake, probably. Louis XVIII has no choice. He accepts that there's going to be a constitutional monarch. England's had one for a while, so I will be a constitutional monarch. And the Constitution is finally written. It's a firmly liberal constitution. Liberal in the sense that the notions of liberty are paramount. No more nobility. You're going to have an election of the 50% of richest. How that can be determined, I have no idea. The 50% of richest in France get to vote. The districts are divided in a more equal fashion. No more gerrymandering. Blah blah blah. Barriers to trade. No more guilds. No more workers' unions. You can imagine how the workers of Paris felt about that. Paper currency issued on the back of the national chart. And most important of all, the metric system was adopted. I don't know say that of course facetiously. What's the metric system? It's quite fabulous. They say, all right, let's base all, instead of somebody's arm length, a yard, let's take something from the natural earth and define it as a meter. Say, oh, here's what we'll do this. The distance from the North Pole to the equator, a quarter of the Earth, will be defined as 10,000 kilometers. So a meter is a fraction, very small. But all you got to do is move the distance one. And the metric system, which is absolutely useless. I was substituting for my daughter in chemistry class. And once again, I apologize. The students said, we used to say in the 60s, in a matter of 20 years, we'll adopt a metric system. We don't say that anymore. We may never adopt it. We apparently are just stupid. And this country is stupid too. So whatever. Foreign reactions to the French Revolution that's gone on so far. Liberals and radicals, and of course, Edmund Burke, the famous Edmund Burke, writes his reflection on the French Revolution. It is famous, depending on your point of view, and very useful, or mostly a bunch of excuse. English, many English intellectuals looked and said, this could easily happen here. England was in trouble at that stage too. They had bad harvests. They had enormous debts from various wars. There was real discontent in cities. And so there's a real campaign to say, these revolutions will not end well. Burke predicts correctly violence and chaos and this and that and so forth. So that is perceived to be accurate because it was accurate. But Thomas Paine will blast him, this famous Mary Wollstonecraft will blast him, saying, yeah, you may be right, it may end in violence, but what's the choice? I mean, things don't change. And if you're going to talk about gradual change, there is no gradual change. The nobility will not be taxed. So what's left other than violence? And so be it. And that argument continues today, except in places like Singapore and this, that, so forth. The monarchs of course, they thought they were still. What do you mean, France? We've all built a palace like Versailles, and now the king is a constitutional monarch, and he might be killed. They absolutely panicked. The royal family was trying to escape. They're caught and brought back. And then things get a little bit crazy. They're crazy enough anyway. They're going to get even more crazy because France is connected to the continent. They don't have the English Channel, which makes things really rather dramatically different than lucky old England with the English Channel. Frederick the Great, Frederick II, Leopold II will say, you know, we support the kings, and we would be willing to invade if things don't settle down a little bit. We would save the king and my sister and so forth. And the French, of course, the French radicals say, you know, hey, up yours, buddy. So the Legislative Assembly, the so-called National Assembly, which has been a volunteer group in the Third Estate in the tennis court vote, now the tennis court, and now they've come back to Paris. They say, we're done. We've done our work. It's time for there to be an election of a real legislative assembly chosen by the people to legislate, not just to talk about raising taxes for the king. Most of them are well educated again, but as the textbook says, they're younger, they're less cautious, and they will declare war on Prussia and Austria before Austria and Prussia declare war on them. And things will go really badly then. I think most of you have been to Paris many times. You've certainly, what's this frieze from? This is one of four on the Arc de Triomphe. And as you walk around, you've got to figure out which of the four. This is that moment when France is in deep trouble because they declared war, but pretty soon the war is going to go quite badly against France. The army is in disarray, of course, because it was the king's army. And volunteers will come walking and singing in Marseille. And there are some interesting phrases that go along with that. But I mean, just the phraseology, it's citizenship, it's your country, it's not the king's country anymore. Come on, citizens, they're coming to kill your wives and your sons. Kill them first. And it's still the national anthem of the French. And things now are getting quite crazy. In August 72, the rumors are rife in Paris. Almost all of them inaccurate, but fear gets spread, and so the royal palace is attacked. The royal family runs to the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, to be stripped, to be saved. New elections are called. The next election is to say we're rewriting the Constitution. The liberal Constitution is not good enough. We're going to rewrite the thing. New elections, please. And now the rumors in Paris get really rather crazy. The Paris mob goes wild. They go into prisons where people that are suspected of being counter-revolutionaries are being held. Many are murdered. Things are quite badly out of hand. And now we will have the second phase, the radical phase, which it has to be taught fairly. It's, yes, there is terrorism, no question about it, but there's something else about it too. So the radical phase, the National Convention is going to declare France a republic with, well, that doesn't look very blue, does it? That looks more like Egypt's flag. That's supposed to be blue, just like that. Why the three pillars? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty, equality, fraternity. And there's other reasons too, but there's also, and there's this interesting, this interesting first symbol here. Just look at the coat of arms that they adopt. Not that these things matter, but the fact sometimes, this is, we've seen this, oh, I think I've seen this before. Where have we seen this before? Mussolini. But it's adopted, it was, the Romans adopted it from the Etruscans. And the idea is that all the single people are bound together in unity for power. If we're bound together for power, we're strong. And there's a wreath of victory. But the wreath of victory in Greece was always a laurel victory, a laurel wreath. This is an oak wreath because of all the strong oak trees in Northern Europe. And there's the rather famous red cap. These caps have been worn by peasants for 2,000 years, but now they're red, the revolutionary cap. And there's the rooster. I never knew this. I never knew this until I looked this up. Well, what's the rooster got to do with France? The French, the Latin for rooster is Gauls. The Latin for Gauls is so it's Gaul, the French Gauls, Caesar conquers Gaul, that's where they get the rooster from. In any case, you got some stuff going on. And this new constitutional convention, they got to write a new constitution, says, here's some of the stuff we're going to do with this new constitution. We're not going to completely mock religion, but we're going to kind of get rid of religion. It's the opiate of the masses, as Karl Marx would say down the road. So we're going to have, outdoor festivals, and we'll have a cult of reason and the cult of the supreme being. And no, it's not Jesus. It's reason. And we're going to have secular holidays and not religious holidays. We're getting rid of saints' days and you don't call yourself, there's no more formal you. We call each other by the informal thou. And we're going to have a new calendar, completely new calendar. The week is going to be 10 days long. Yeah.
Is this all coming from the intelligentsia or?
Yes. It's coming from the intelligentsia.
And so the masses are going, no.
The masses, well, the urban masses might be okay.
Yeah, but not.
The countryside is not, and there will be revolts out in the countryside.
Yeah.
They say we've got a 10-day week, a decade, 10 makes sense. We're going to have a 10-day week, and nobody knows. The months are all going to be named after, fog and after harvest and wheat and heat and so forth. And we're not going to have any saints holidays and we're not going to start with December, from January 1st. What the hell? We'll start like this. The first day of the year is going to be September 22nd. And we'll work our way through here. And this is the year one. It's a new world. We're not going back to the death of Christ, to the birth of Christ. And of course, this is way too much for an awful lot of people. And it won't last very long, and it can be mocked rather easily. And then the vote comes where we're going to kill by one vote. They say, let's kill it. It's the same as the killing of Roman officers in the Russian Revolution. You kind of got to do it if you're that brutal. There's no going back. It's over. And it's a shame. Maybe this wasn't a bad person. It was just stupid. Whatever. There's two real issues besides all that nonsense that face the convention. The war against Prussia and Austria is going terribly. And it's going to be even worse now the convention declares war on Britain, Holland, and Spain, and that's really brilliant. They're full of it. They're sure that they're every high school football team known to man. They're going to finish the season before the season starts 10-0, and then the first game happens. And in Paris, there's a massive problem. Because the country's in chaos. And this once again, the sun now they're being called the Sans Culottes. Sans meaning without what? Without knee breeches. These knee breeches where they only come down to above your knee, and you're actually wearing trousers. and they're going to try the event yet again. Eventually, they'll run out of it. They're wanting amok. Robespierre, who's the leader of one of the factions, one of the more radical factions in the convention, is able to manipulate their anger to rounding up his equally radical rivals, but they hate each other as equal radical rivals, and arrest them. Many cities, not to mention provinces, are in absolute revolt against the convention. France, Austria, all the other foreigners, the revolution is essentially over. All that is controlled by the convention now, more like Paris itself. And the convention will give 12 guys, here included, the public safety, 53 powers. As the textbook says, a year later, they won. France is victorious all over Europe. I said, huh? How did that happen? How did it happen? At least according to almost any textbook you ever read. How did it happen that when a country in utter chaos, with revolt in its own territories and being attacked by now 5 countries, we'll talk about that later. The 5 countries are really not going to attack. The idea that there's 5 countries aligned against France is nonsense. And they formally were, but they were more suspicious of one another than they were of France. So, but nonetheless, the textbook will say, here's the 3 core ideas in how this works. First off, you get a purely planning time. There aren't a lot of resources. Whatever resources there are, they're going to go to feed the peasants, and to feed the poor, and to feed the army. And that's probably all the money we got, and the rest of it is spent on arms. We're going to play national. We're going to play modern nationalism. No more king and country. This is, well, no more king and country. It's just country. This is your country. That's your flag. It's your land that's going to be taken away. You want it, you got to fight for it. And of course, if there's anyone that disagrees with you, you just lock them up. Better yet, you just chop their head off. It works. It works. Planned economy. Maximum prices declared on almost everything. Fixed price of bread. You've got a ration. There'll be no more luxury anything, including cakes and pastries and wine for that matter. All the protection is going to be directed to the war, and that's about it. This will sound, of course, like Stalin. Well, this is Stalin from 1924 or 1934. And because it's more or less successful, Hitler doesn't win. I know it'll drive people crazy. I'll defend that. Any textbook will say that that's fair. So it's small workshops, you nationalize for war. You're going to produce food, wages, and food, and you may not get out. Tough. You don't like it, there's a guillotine over there for you. We are in the war for real. Otherwise, the revolution is completely over. And so, yeah, we're taking your grain. We're probably not going to pay you market prices. We're not paying you at all. So keep what you need to get through the winter. But that's the way it is. And then you play this stuff, which we are very familiar with. I'm afraid to say, disgusted to say, frankly. It is incredibly powerful and remains powerful today. And some of us would say this is one of the major problems in world history these days. It's your country. It's your family. It's yours. It's going to be taken away from you. So you should be willing to go out and volunteer and fight. And it works. When you're fighting an all-professional army who's being paid to fight, and you're willing to die for your loved ones back home, it'll probably work. Ask the Taliban. And you get this decree. All young men are going to go. There's a draft. Everyone's going to be part of it to some degree. And being soldiers in 14 armies, and they have rolled back. They have rolled back the invading forces. To be fair, the invading forces were not terribly well motivated. The soldiers had to do the fighting as well, despite what the King of France says. And nor were Austria and Prussia pretty well coordinated. But it's, and then there's the third fact. That is, if you disagree with us, we're not going to bother too much with jailing. We might jail you for a day, but there'll be a judgment in a matter of hours, and we'll just kill you. And if the middle class was the bitch, and our former radical friends want a bitch, we'll kill them too. Which is pretty awful. You got a spy system, and when the tension is over, of course, the terrible. It's just too much. You don't trust in the city anymore. You don't know whether you can even trust your own family. So the rebels start turning on each other. First, Robespierre will turn on Danton. He'll turn on Robespierre because they'll be next. And pretty soon he's killed. And then it's over. Once the terror is gone and once the foreign troops are out of the country, and the third stage will happen. And this is a pretty disgusting 7 years. The directory, the so-called, what's called the Thermidorian reaction, because this is the month of Thermidor or July, hot July. And so the middle class professionals will come back and the liberal freedoms are returned, all the interests of the sans culotte, that is, set price of bread, are done away with, and very disgusting. A war that is now unnecessary continues. Because the soldiers want to fight it, they're gaining land, and they're getting, and you have young men who are making their careers. They were peasants or middle class nothings back home, or they were sort of tiny little irrelevant nobility from Corsica. They're making their careers. They can only make their careers if there's an army, if there's a fight. We want to continue I want to show how good I am. I want to move up in the world. So, this exact same thing happens in the United States at exactly the same time. Our Constitution has been passed, and there's a kind of this disgusting orgy of self-indulgence that sweeps through the rich in both the colonies and in France. It is, as the textbook says, particularly characterized by low-cut dresses and see-through gowns that the mistresses and wives wore. But you had exactly the same thing in the U.S. colonies, and exactly the same time, to the great disgust of the common people. Economic control is abolished, paper money, competitive inflation, political organizations. This is where the laborers in Paris had their strength. They were restricted, private property above anything else. There will be a revolt of the common people against the directory, which they hate. It's put down by the army. Of course, it's put down by the army. What's the army get out of this deal? They get to continue fighting the war, which they want to fight, because these generals are making their career, and these people are living off the land. They're taxing the people they conquered. They probably got other 5 or 6 women that they have sort of accumulated as whatever. It's really rather ugly. The Constitution, another Constitution. This is what is the 4th or 5th Constitution. How many of there are already now? This passed. Voting by, and you can see how restrictive this upper bourgeois is now going to be. Voting by males over 25, but they only get to vote for electors. And the electors then will choose the legislature. That sounds very familiar. We're not going to give real power to people. And a 5-man directory chosen by lot, so that's why it's called a directory. And then it's a military industrial complex. It really before I've already made a point that not necessarily the common soldier, although the common soldier may be having an adventure out and maybe stealing stuff from people they conquer, who knows. But the upper officers are making a career of themselves, and they are happy to continue to fight the war. There's an actual election in '97, and this directory is overthrown, and the Constitution is going to be recalled, and there's a coup. The army is called in to say, well, the election doesn't count, and now the directory just rules as a dictatorship.
So how much much of Europe did they actually control?
Oh, not, well, as far as Denmark, I mean, the Low Countries, towards Switzerland, not that far yet.
And part of Spain?
And part of Spain, it's in 1797 that one of these ambitious officers, his name is Napoleon, will come into Italy. And the Italian armed masses welcome him as the great liberator. This is fantastic. He's brought an end to all the feudal dues that they have been paying since the end of the Roman Empire. And he's kicked out the Austrians because they're ruled by Austrians now. And now there's 50 republics declared every week. Most of them won't survive a week after that. But it's unbelievable stuff. Back in countryside, during the time of the directive, the countryside goes back to its old rhythm of the rhythms of life, birth, marriage, death, all of it celebrated in the church around your friends. And so the peasants, as has been said before, are not terribly involved in much of this naturalistic enthusiasm unless you're an ambitious young man and then you want to make your career in the military if you can. Napoleon himself, he's a child of the Alliance. He has been raised, he's from an irrelevant, noble family that doesn't have much money, I think in Corsica. What he accomplishes, he doesn't accomplish this on his own, but he will save it. He will confirm that the French Revolution has happened and that it's here to stay, even though after he's gone, there will be some attempt to roll some of it back. I mean, and all the Code Napoleon, that's still the legal code of France and the legal code of much of Europe, or most of it at any rate. The way that the high schools are run and the university, the grand écoles are run, that's Napoleon's doing. Of course, they evolved in their curriculum over time. The rank of France is saved. And then he has this idea that maybe someday we can have a single unified Europe again. That of course won't happen. It's going to happen someday, or I don't think humanity will make it. That was the glory of the Roman Empire. We can be a single economic unit, and people can worship as they wish and so forth. And so he's got that in mind. That is a dream of the Enlightenment. He apparently is a brilliant general, and he does. In 97, it's into Italy, where he is welcomed for a while. The time will pass, and the people that he's conquered will realize we're paying more taxes than the French. That doesn't seem fair. And it's not fair. He will go on to Egypt, and the textbooks will always say, well, he fails in Egypt. Why did I put this up here? Oh yeah, this some of you may be familiar with this novel. If you're really looking for something to read, I'd encourage you to read this before the next session. It is a fantastic novel. I promise you will like it. By Stendhal, one of the greatest novels ever written. It is about the period after Napoleon is gone, and the red and the black are the young bourgeois man. Julian Sorel wants to make his career in France. He would prefer to do it like Napoleon in the army, though red, but he can't. He's going to have to be a priest, and it's really rather. I shouldn't have thrown this in here right now. So threw off the momentum here. But this is it makes the point, I suppose, that Napoleon has made such an impression on the youth of France and what could happen if things got there. This idea that he was a failure in France, Europe. If you, as some of you know, we're in Istanbul for a whole while. When you do the reading of all that, this is the moment when the Ottoman Empire realizes, holy shit, we are way the hell behind. It's a shock to them. Because it's not just that he conquers the Ottoman rulers in Egypt, who now Egypt is going to be more or less independent, but he brings all this enlightenment stuff, the printing press, the ideas of literacy in secular schools and science and tolerance and religion. And it's a mind-blowing moment for these people in the Ottoman Empire who wouldn't have had any recourse to this kind of stuff until he shows up. It sets off an incredible series of dominoes that fall in the Ottoman Empire, including this guy Muhammad Ali, who is, he's not a boxer. He's an Albanian. He's an Albanian serving the Ottoman Empire. He will take over Egypt, and he is on the verge of turning Egypt into a semi-modern state. Why it fails is an interesting story. Because it fails because the British screwed with debts. And he's got the idea that there should be a canal here someday. And he has his engineers go out and figure out where the canal should be, and yada, yada, yada. They find the Rosetta Stone. So, the British will then cut off his retreat back to France by sinking the French Navy. But the idea that it's a failure, at least in terms of the Mideast, is kind of horrible. In any case, back he goes. And by now, the people that have a clue of what's going on in the National Legislative Assembly say, this directory is so corrupt and so pathetic, so incompetent, we need a coup. So who's the best guy for the coup? Let's bring in Napoleon. It's all prearranged. He sort of walks in, and then there's celebration that he's now in charge. And he's been handed France because this whole idea of elected assembly doing a good job just is not working out terribly well. So go to an enlightened monarch. So you go from a consulship to a dictatorship to an empire, the era of Napoleon. It's sort of insufferable in some ways, but it does some stuff. So that there will be a series of new constitutions now. The one that is now going to be in power, give the power to Napoleon, resembles more than anything else the constitution or the idea of the government that Caesar Augustus had back in the glory days of the Roman Empire. I tried to make the point that if you want to talk about the glory of the Roman Empire, its glory years from about for 150, 170 years, he gets the credit. He's the one that sets it up. An enlightened dictator of sorts. There'll be a three-council council. That's a Roman term, right? Three-council executive, but the first council's got most of the power. That's Napoleon. They asked to approve of this. Almost everybody currently says yes. It's amended. The Constitution is amended to make Napoleon first consul for life. And then in 1804, why not just have a dynasty called the Napoleonic dynasty? And Napoleon's mother is sitting there at the inauguration and says, "This is garbage. This is ridiculous. How long is this? Is just nonsense. How long is this last?" And the answer is, she knew, she has a sense that this is kind of silly. In any case, he's got 11 years before he's done in 1804. And what happens then? He is one of these Caesar Augustus kind of figures that shows up every now and then. If any society is lucky enough to get them and has the power to do stuff, says, all right, we need to find a series of compromises in which everyone gets something and no one's left out and everyone can buy in. It's still the code of law of France today. Equality of all male citizens. Eventually it's got to be females. When did French women get to vote? After World War II. 1948. Not until 1948. Unbelievable. Never mind. So all males get to vote, but wealth is secure. We're going to have a Bank of France. It's going to serve several interests. One, it's going to spend money to benefit all of France. But by the way, it will also loan money to the financial elite to make sure that the progress is made in the industry and so forth. The land that the peasants got, they keep. Immigrants, the people that left because they were afraid, they hated the revolution, they were welcome back. Swear an oath. You're not going to get your land back. That's gone. But you come on back. And we would love to have you because many of you are well educated and we need you. So come on back and be part of France. And maybe we'll make you a kind of lord, like we won't call it a lord like you do in England, but an imperial nobility. Other things, and then probably the thing that gets the most press, the most textbook is careers open to talent. We want the most talented people. We don't care if you're first, we don't care what you look like. You can't be female, that's true. And just prove it. And here's the schools to go to. We know, we don't have the kind of school system yet where a poor kid can go to school for 12 years, but we're working on it. And this, which characterizes France still today, it's a centralized economy, a centralized, not economy, a centralized bureaucracy. So, which includes all sorts of things, including a department to keep the French language pure. And every year they go through, and it is pure. I mean, the grammar is, the rules are the rules, the rules are the rules. Whereas English, oh, you know, you just whatever. Whether you like that or not. And then he does this very important thing. He says Mussolini will do the same thing in Rome in the 1920s. Make a deal with the church. And it's a deal that mostly benefits France, but makes the Pope at least somewhat happy. Catholics are free to worship. And even to the point that you say France is a Catholic country, but it's not the official religion. But the government will determine the bishops, the government will play the card. He even goes so far as to say, and I'm also going to pay the Protestants as well, because they don't want to look like favoritism here. So we'll pay the Protestant priests as well. He's trying to balance as many issues as he possibly can to solidify this thing. Other stuff. I mean, a massive building program in Paris alone just to create jobs for urban workers. And so, you know, sooner or later, you're going to get the Arc de Triomphe, but it's all sorts of things being knocked down and put up. Traffic has changed. You've got a sewer system that's going to look like a real sewer system, as opposed to just dumping things in the rivers. 3 new bridges. The Louvre's converted into a museum. The bread prices, the government, there's not many prices set, some are set. You return to doing what the French, the radical revolution said, anyone can go to anyone can be a doctor if they want, we just need help. And they said, no, you can't be a doctor unless you've gone to the training. We need that back. We're gonna have firemen in publicly built barracks all around the city for fires. This sounds to me like Augustus way back in the Roman Empire trying to create order. You got a common street numbering system so that you know where the hell you are. And these grand universities, we're shifting the curriculum from theology and literature to engineering and science, and it's still there today. These are the schools that create the bureaucrats. And if you graduate from those schools and your goal is to be one of the bureaucrats of France, your training is science and technology. It is not literature at all. And so you're supposed to come in there knowing what science and technology is. Well, does that mean France is the greatest country in the world today? No. But on the other hand, it's to make sure things go right, he has sacrificed some interests. Disgusting. I mean, women are still the dependents of their husbands and fathers, can't make contracts. Freedom of speech is dramatically controlled. Newspapers doing this before or 5. And there's this ruthless spy to make sure that, but the average French person wants orders more than they want anything else. By 1802, the revolution is more or less over, as most textbooks would say. This is from another textbook. Full exposure from another textbook would say. And then the French could look at into the rest of Europe and say, you know, we've created a system here that looks really quite modern. What's with you? Most of what the early state had wanted in terms of freedoms are confirmed by law, they're enforced. France, which is the most populous and most wealthy, now has the ability to tax everybody and to use the money for citizens, and it's going to hire citizens of ability, not birth. Whether that's perfect is never perfect. There's peace with the papacy. The French peasants are more or less satisfied. The other group that's not happy are the urban workers. And they will sort of meld into those sewers for 30 years. And they'll show up again in 1830 in a big way. But he has saved the revolution. Now what? Unsettled was what's France's relationship with the rest of Europe. in that age and two, he's at peace with everybody. There's no war with anybody. But that's not what the vision of the Enlightenment is. The vision of the Enlightenment is, and remains today, that there will be something like universal human rights on planet Earth, back then in Europe. That there will be legal and commercial codes that everyone will follow, no cheating, sending your extra wealth to wherever, South Dakota included, I guess. Religious freedom for everybody, something that looked like the Roman Empire in some degree. Not a bunch of tribal groups saying, you know, we're sovereign, so we do. Texas says no abortions. You do whatever you want to do. We say no abortions. We're free to do that because we are Texas, and the Constitution says we're so. That's hardly the goal of the Enlightenment. It may be all you can get. So I want to spend at least 5 minutes on this because it's something. All that's great sounding, depending on your point of view. The revolution would say, what goes on in Haiti? What goes on in Haiti? You know, we know it as Haiti. Back then, the first called it something name. Later, the Haitians adopted the name Haiti, which was from an Indian name. These Indians they've all died off. There's none left of diseases and so forth. It was by far the richest colony in the 18th century empire. It produced sugar more efficiently than any sugar plantation in the Caribbean, Dutch or British, by far. I mean, they were producing most of the sugar, half of the coffee consumed in Europe. It was an enormously productive colony. It was also the place where at least a third of the slaves every year came because they died off so quickly in brutal, horrendous work conditions. And this is happening just about the time of the French Revolution, liberty, equality for everybody. This is slavery revolt in 1791. That's rather right in the middle of the French Revolution. The French constitutions here say that there's no slavery, but the directory refuses to enforce the abolishment. This guy, Toussaint L'Ouverture's, his army controls not just Haiti, but the other side of the island. It's now called the Dominican Republic. They say, look, we're self-governing, but we do not declare independence from France. In fact, we're taking in loan oil to France. We know you could, we know we better not declare independence. Let's work with us, please. Still, this great guy, Napoleon, Mr. Enlightenment, said, no, I'm going to reconquer Haiti. He fails because the British help and tropical diseases, malaria, and so forth work. And so he fails, and Napoleon says, well, that's it. The dream of getting Haiti back and frankly getting anything in North America back is over.
Mostly the tropical diseases. I mean,
Mostly tropical diseases.
His naval forces and his army died of
They
yellow
died.
fever.
And the British were able to keep any reinforcements coming. So it fails. And what's the result for us? We get the Louisiana Purchase. There's negotiations going on in France at the time where we are trying to buy New Orleans, and the negotiations from Napoleon show up and say, well, how about the whole thing?
Wow.
And our negotiators can't figure out how to get a message back to Washington, D.C. fast enough. Well, of course, it's not Washington, D.C. At that stage, it's still in New York. That's the capital. And it happens. We get probably the biggest land bargain in history of the earth, perhaps. And Lewis and Clark were going in there trying to figure out what the hell's going on. But what a deal. To some degree, a gift of Haiti and tropical diseases. And so then what is the response in the United States? Well, Haiti has been a successful slavery bill. So because we are afraid, or Jefferson and others are afraid of encouraging a slave revolt in the United States, we refuse to recognize Haiti and put an embargo against all trade against Haiti. As a reward for whatever they were able to do for us. They didn't do it for us, but it benefited. And then later, you'll see it in the next slide, the French come in and demand that the Haitians pay for all the land they took, plus the slaves, because slaves were property too. So you need to pay for that. And by the time Haiti had paid off all of that, Haiti was the basket case of the world. And that's the next slide. It's not the French Revolution, 1925. Back comes France demanding an indemnity. You got to pay us for all the land you confiscated and the slaves, they were private property too. We'll tell you what they were worth. You don't have the money, we'll lend you the money at high interest rates. It means you'll never pay it back in your lifetime or your kid's lifetime, and you'll always be. Pretty soon Haiti is exporting no sugar due to embargoes as boycotts in the United States at once. And then in 1893, private minister of the US Bank said, we'll buy that debt. We'd like to buy that debt and have the Haitians pay us. And the debt then gets paid back finally. And that debt is paid back to what we now call Citibank of New York. God. And of course, Haiti's a basket case. I mean, it's a terrible, black people can't rule themselves. Black people, they're black. And you look at these words, I was somewhere at my junior year in college and this stuff showed up. News to me, I didn't know I got the thing in high school. And I got pissed off and I'm still pissed off. What the hell? I mean, are you serious about this? Or are you just bullshit? Are you really? Well, then do something for God's sake. And I'm going to die. I'm pissed off. That's fine with me. All right. So back to the French Revolution. This is not from the French Revolution. Most of you know that, right? This is Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. That was from 1830. But it sure is useful for the French Revolution because one, it's got a French flag, and two, what's the whole point of these figures right here in the excitement about the French Revolution? You've got a dwarf, you've got a poor kid. This is a little bit serious, but he's got a red hat on, the revolutionary, a middle-class person. The French are behind Napoleon, hook, line, and sinker, because he has saved the revolution. He is winning victories. There's unity that France has for a little while that will last, that has never gotten back. If we go all the way through this class, you'll see it's still not there, and getting it back will be hard. Anyone know what's Republic? This was the first, the radical phase of the first Republic. Anyone know what Republic went to France now?
Second.
Fifth. We're in the fifth. We're in the fifth Republic. This is not this. Now, this is not a republic. We won't get a republic yet until 1848, and it will only last three months. And then there'll be a third republic and a fourth republic. And then de Gaulle demands a fifth republic, and he basically writes the Constitution, which looks very much like what Napoleon got. He wanted a sense of a presidential dictatorship and got something quite similar to that. The French legislature doesn't really have a lot of power. Whatever. That's comparative government. Oh, and then Napoleon goes full hogs. It's kind of disgusting in some ways. On the other hand, as one textbook says, it is a masterpiece of modern propaganda. I mean, the majesty of Rome. We got this Roman stuff. We've got a crown that looks like Rome. It's Christian. The Pope is there. France is the cream of the crop of European civilization. And what about the rest of Europe? He changes Europe forever. Eventually, Europe will revolt against him for reasons which are more complicated and simple. Here, he's being welcomed in Rome. Fearless is over. This concept of popular sovereignty is something we've been talking about in our here and there. Trial by jury, never heard of it. Equality before the law, that's an interesting concept. The citizen army, freedom for all this stuff. You brought that, great. It won't last because one, these guys don't know how to rule themselves very well anyway. The Austrians will come back, and Napoleon will overtax these people compared to what the French are paying to keep the French happy back home. But the ideas won't go away. As far as new political boundaries in Europe, it's unbelievable how it waits for Napoleon to start doing this. I mean, if you go to Switzerland, the Swiss are honest about it and say, forget William Tell. Switzerland is the creation of Napoleon. He created Napoleon. Switzerland was created by Napoleon. Yeah, the Hail to the Republic is the creation of, it says, you 26 cantons, for God's sake, you are now united. And I'll give you some advice on how to react. That concept doesn't, the 320 different units which had been the Holy Roman Empire, most are gone. And the unification of Germany is jump-started. I'm going to remind myself to talk about the city of Trier. Austria is temporarily out of Italy. And Italy, the Italians have some idea that maybe we Italians can actually rule a place where our native language occurs, not be ruled by the war. Poland comes back. It's been divided by the three awful countries, the consuming countries, Russia and Austria and Prussia, and it is back in the form of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw for a little while. It will disappear again. Other things happen. So it doesn't look like the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is finally gone. God knows it was long overdue, but it doesn't exist anymore. The Duchy of Warsaw will give the Poles hope that maybe someday we'll get Poland back. This, Illyria provinces, the Balkans, people in the Balkans will get some hope that maybe someday we could be independent and self-ruling, not pushed around by Ottomans, or pushed around by Austrians, etc. Right here, so a really interesting fact is right here, because that was normally Prussia, but now it's France, because France has got the west side of the Rhine River, and because it is in France at that very moment, what happens in one family of Jews in Trier? That family of Jews is the Marx family. The Jews aren't allowed to be liars, but under the French Revolution, they are. And so Marx's father says, "Fantastic! I'm going to stop being a rabbi. I'm going to get along with him." He's the best lawyer in town, and is elected chair of the legal community there in Trier. But when the revolution is over and that Trier goes back to Prussia, he's got a choice to make. Either continue to be a Jew and a lawyer, one or the other. If I'm Jewish, I'm going to be one of my law. If I convert to Christianity, I can stay a lawyer. And that's what he does. He converts to Lutheranism. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that made it just at a tiny little level, but you can see that might have an effect on young Carl and what. All right. These ideas they were there in the Enlightenment anyway, and now they breathe. They've actually happened in the most populous, richest country in France. Every one of them, in a certain sense, has sort of happened. And of course, they conflict with one another. Liberalism and radical republicanism are not exactly the same thing. This means every man and maybe every woman too gets to vote. Liberalism, maybe we just have electors. Socialism is something altogether different. Conservatism is backwards. And then nationalism, well, that's contradicting most of these Enlightenment ideas. The idea of the Enlightenment is these are universal ideas. It's not just for one country by itself. One country may leave, but we work for everybody. Those ideas won't go away, and that will be the rest of the course and the rest of our life. The debate among these various isms that show up and remain in conflict and battle for ideas. There's nothing there about ecology or that kind of stuff. Not yet, because the Industrial Revolution was just about to happen and everything was fine for a while. So you'll see in the next chapters, once the revolution is over, the old guys try to go back. They'll put kings back on the throne. The kings are saying, we will do everything in our power. We're going to have spies in university classrooms. When they teach society this Enlightenment stuff, we're going to shut down the professor. I mean, this goes on for 1850 to 1848, but there's no going back. The ideas are out of the bag, and once they're out of the bag, it's just no going back. There are still some places like Afghanistan where people haven't caught on yet. Someday. And, and the hysteria was sort of right, the social chaos. Yeah, the old system is dying. We're not sure what comes next. And it's very confusing. So we're not sure what the next thing is. And of course they wouldn't be confused because you really didn't, won't be until 1880 till you say, well, now we really see what happened. And that is, well, Trump all Trumps. This trumps them all. This becomes number one, which is, of course, World War I, World War II, and still today. Still today. There's the Marx family. I should have said that for another day. What? This good. You want to read that? Yeah. Well, there it is. There's 3 here. It's in France now. It's going to be back in Prussia.
So why do you think the revolution in France was so different than the revolution here? I mean, I agree. I think it was a war of independence more than a revolution, but still, why do you think they went through so many attempts and?
Because they're connected to Europe. It would have stopped. It would have probably stopped with that first phase.
Without the wars.
It would have probably stopped the first phase, but the monarchs of Europe said, we're not letting this stand. We are not going to let a bunch of rabble in France and a bunch of free-thinking people turn our monarch into a constitutional monarch. And we will invade. Now, whether they could, and they were having enormous success. So the revolution had to move on to a more radical phase. You could say the same thing in Russia. Where did we get there? But let's preview it. Lenin knew within months of his incredibly easy success in November. As any documentary will tell you, the Bolsheviks just walked into the legislature and took over. There's nobody there. It was no big revolution. The war was so incredibly unpopular. The bourgeois had already left for Paris or for Stanford. If you were Kerensky, you were going to teach in Stanford for long. And John Lennon.
As a freshman, he came into our dorm for an evening bullshit.
When there was a February Revolution where the middle class took over in Russia, and Kerensky was in charge. But he continued fighting World War I. Well, good luck. The Russians didn't want to fight World War I anymore. So away he went. But Lenin said, we got to bring rich people back. We don't know how to run things. We were good at fighting the revolution. We got to bring them back. And was talking about doing that. But instead of that happening, what did Napoleon, what did Lenin and Trotsky have to face exactly like the French Revolution? An invasion from foreign forces. Germans were sent in, British sent in, Japanese sent in, we sent in troops to invade and say, we're going to turn back the Russian Revolution. And we're going to find Nicholas II or anyone who's left in the family, put the Tsar back on.
But didn't the Americans face similar things with the French and the British trying to come back and all those?
Oh, now let's be careful about the French, not the French.
Well, I mean, they were still, the Europeans were trying to
No,
impact them. Right?
No.
What was that?
no. What was the War of 1812 about? Who started the War of 1812? Now, look at the time period. Be careful. It's the War of 1812. We're looking at what was the War of 1812 all about? A bunch of rednecks from Kentucky and southern Indiana. That's it. That's it. Southern Indiana and Tennessee said, the British are involved with fighting Napoleon in Europe. This is our chance to take Canada. And up they went to a city called York and burned that city of York. And were making. And meanwhile, the Americans who were living on the border of Canada said, "No way in hell! You're coming up to start a war. We're the ones who are going to die. You suffer from Tennessee and Kentucky and Indiana." You're coming, there's a bunch of idiots trying to start a war.
The Brits were helping the Indians.
The British were helping the Indians.
And the guy got put in Indiana because that was gonna be the one place that Indians could be, it's like, we swear, if we just take Ohio, we're done.
Yeah.
And so they went and Tecumseh, set up shop in what's now Lafayette, Indiana, Purdue.
And the Cleveland Institute was called the Indians. I still are the Indians. So the British said, "Bull, this is not going to stand." I mean, they burned York, which we now call Toronto. We'll burn Washington D.C. We started the damn thing. The British wanted no parts of that. My God, they were bidding with Napoleon, and the proof that they were not interested in it was they had us on the run. I mean, Madison left the capital away. Luckily, his more courageous wife stood around and manned the White House for a while. I mean, she said, "Where the hell are you going? I'm going to take pictures of them." So no, they didn't face any. Now it is true. It is fair to say in the Civil War, the British did think once or twice about supporting the Confederates because it would help their textile industry.
Yes.
They said no, that wouldn't help where the Southerners came in. No, so I think it's frankly more or less as simple as that, and you could even go so far as to say the same thing in China. I mean, who did we back in World War II? And the two forces that, in theory, were both fighting Japan. That is Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. We backed Chiang Kai-shek, who everyone knew was just corrupted in hell, more corrupt than. Well, there's nothing more. We win on corruption these days, but back then he was. So this outside influence pushes these revolutions to the point that if they're going to save it. And so there's always been this argument. So Napoleon was the dictator, son of a bitch, awful. Well, let's finish the slides here because most of you know where Napoleon is these days. What's the point of this? No, but back up. Can you back up to the slide? So we're there. The question to finish this off is: there's all these battles, and some people love battles. I hate military history. I hate it. And so I don't like teaching it. I won't teach it, but just a little bit of it. So in 1802, France is at peace with most countries. Remember, Austria and Prussia had first tried to invade to overcome the first phase of the French Revolution. They were having success, but not really because they were in cahoots. They probably were more concerned about each other and Russia than they were France, to be frank. So it was never really a tremendously effective campaign. And you could see how ineffective it was because once you had the radical phase producing a nationalized army full of patriotism, they easily pushed those countries back and they sued for peace quickly. No one trusted the British. There wasn't a country in the world, in Europe, that really wanted to be alive. They knew they needed Britain for money, they needed Britain for trade, but they didn't like the British. So even though the British occasionally helped out, they were not particularly beloved by anybody. When Napoleon decided to get rid of the Holy Roman Empire, an interesting thing occurred. Most of the big parts of the Holy Roman Empire, like Prussia and Bavaria and Hamburg, fairly large sections, as opposed to these tiny little 3-acre kingdoms, came begging one by one to Napoleon, "Let me take over this, let me take over that." They were just kissing his butt, saying, we know this is over. So it wasn't as if they were particularly opposed to getting rid of the Holy Roman Empire. And on it went. Now Napoleon's in charge, and he has. This is a tough one. That's not that tough. I mean, he was very ambitious and full of himself for sure. He also seemed to have been motivated then by the idea that let's try and put Europe back together in a unified way. To what degree each of those two somewhat contradictory things were dominant at any one time, we'll never know. No one will ever know. I guess there's better stuff written about that than incapable of talking about. But he did have the idea that, no, I want to keep pushing. I would like Poland, I have Polish friends. I would like Poland to exist again. I'm, after all, from Corsica. I would like Italy to have a nation state somewhere down the road. But I don't really want nation states anyway. I sort of worry about Europe, and everyone should be on board with these Enlightenment ideas. And so he went back to battle, and Austria and Prussia fought him again. They were in his line of fire. By the time, now we go forward here a little bit. Go forward a little bit here. The game changer to some degree was this guy, Alexander I, the grandson of Catherine the Great. He's only, she loved him and helped tutor him and got him a French tutor, a Swiss tutor, who ended up being a great supporter of the French Revolution, taught him the Enlightenment, and promoted to him, Alexander I, he was a man of destiny too, and could help change Europe in impressive ways. Catherine had been an incredible empress, as you well know, and an Enlightenment despot herself, and was hoping, corresponding with Voltaire about these ideas. His arrival on the scene will change the game. So when and as this graph that you saw before said, Russia's passing now France in terms of population. Doesn't mean it's an effective population. Doesn't mean it's an industrial population. But it's a real power. It wasn't and still now. So you got these battles, and they're going through all these battles. Well, this is important. What happens at the Battle of Trafalgar? Where is the battle?
French and Spanish fleets get whacked.
Yeah. Napoleon is pretty sure that if he can get his fleet up here just for a couple days and get enough troops into Britain, Britain will surrender. They may well have been right, but the fleet never gets there because Battle of Trafalgar, the French fleet is sunk. Who's the Nelson? And so you've all been to London. You've gone to Trafalgar Square, and there's Nelson on top of the column. So that dream is over. So that isn't going to happen. So it's funny, he's going to fight Prussia. He has a devastating whacking of Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz. The Prussians fight on, and the Battle of Jena, Austerlitz, the Prussians themselves are defeated, and they more or less surrender. And now, it's at that moment that Alexander I sort of intercedes. He doesn't know, he's no friend of these guys. He wants their land. He especially wants a lot of this land that the Austrians claim down here. The Austrians, the Ottoman Empire's fallen apart. Everyone knows the Austrian Empire's fallen apart. Austria thinks it's going to be theirs. I think it's going to be theirs. And so these are not allies in any sense, but they're all sort of looking at her. Alexander II first to say, I'm not ready to fight Napoleon yet. He's too strong. Let's have I will accept the meeting that he wants to have. There's this famous meeting right here. In the middle of a river, they get the two guys get on a barge where they're in neutral territory. Alexander I and Napoleon get together. The poor king of Russia is there described walking up front. Of course, if they say the wrong thing, I don't have a country anymore. So, and they basically agreed to divide up the world. Wow. Napoleon talks, in fantasy land. Napoleon says, "You're young like me. You're ambitious like me. You have similar ideas like me." It's a charm offensive, and says, "Look, it makes sense. I'm here in France. If you will accept these borders, we're gonna take half of Prussia's territory away. You get some of it. Some of it goes to what's going to eventually be Poland. If you will accept those borders, you carte blanche to take the Ottoman Empire, to take India. Both of us hate Britain. If you can take India, we're on your side." And it's at this moment, Alexander I already in 1800 is moving toward the Caucasus, trying to get what we know as Georgia and Armenia, and he's moving toward India in the Great Game. So there's a whole lot going on here, and Alexander I, to some degree, falls for it. He's not a dumb man, but he will accept that. But I should have gone back. Then please sleep. You don't have to write. And then Napoleon thinks he's got all the rest of Europe except Britain in his palm of his hand. He says, okay, we're going to starve Britain now. We're going to have this continental system. No trade with Britain. Everybody in Europe is not going to trade with Britain. Good luck. You can't pull that off. And one by one, I mean, there's of course there's piracy and the British are sneaking in. People want British goods. They want to trade with Britain. Yada yada yada. And finally, Napoleon gets pissed off at Alexander first. You're not maintaining the continental blockade like you promised to do. So I'm just going to punish you. I'm going to Moscow. And we all know that. He's got this enormous army, nearly 500,000 people. More than half of them, only 2/3, 1/3 of them French, most of them Prussians and others. And he's marching toward Moscow. He's approaching Moscow. September 7th, this famous Battle of Borodino happens. And you've heard it before because you've probably heard the 1812 overture by Tchaikovsky. Surely you have. And if you've heard it, you're vaguely aware of the Marseillaise and the Russian national anthem, sort of rebound back and forth throughout the whole thing. And at the end of it, it's Cracker Pockets. There's shotgun, cannons going off all over the place. And if you went to UCLA, you certainly know it because it was the play that everybody and what happens at the Battle of Borodino? It's not that Napoleon loses, but he is stopped outside of Moscow. And what's that allow? It's sort of unbelievable because the same thing will happen to Hitler. Yeah, he will arrive in October. Snow's already in the ground, and the city's burning. And there's no food to be had and no fuel. Alexander and the Russians have said, we will suffer. We will burn our homes. Imagine the French doing that to Hitler. It's unimaginable. It just doesn't happen. So Alexander has moved his troops outside of Moscow, further east. Napoleon has no choice. He's got to try and march back in the middle of winter now. And there's this, many of you have seen this graphic. It is so famous. I mean, the size, the width of the graphic is the size of the Russian of the Napoleon's force going in. 422,000 on the way in. He leaves some troops behind for his retreat or to keep things at peace. So the number of troops will dwindle as things go. But he arrives at Moscow with 100,000. Now 100,000. They got to march back. And this is a graph of the temperature as winter comes along. And here is 0. And now we're down to, and this is centigrade. So it's 10 degrees, it's 20 degrees below 0. I mean, high tells back to Paris. He just takes it back. No more than 40,000 troops will make it back. It's an utter disaster. So Napoleon's finished. He'll fight on for a little while, but he will be captured. He'll be sent to the island of Elba in the Adriatic. No, the Mediterranean. He's not the Adriatic. He'll escape. He'll come back for another. He'll raise an army, which is not effective, and head toward Belgium, and he's met in Waterloo by Wellington and so forth. And it's over, and he ends his life somewhere stuck in the middle of the Atlantic in St. Helena. He doesn't live there much longer. Whether he was poisoned, there was arsenic in his autopsy. So what does France think about this guy? You know what they think about him. Most of you have been there. I mean, there's this enormous. This is the hospital for soldiers that had been built by Louis XIV. And there's this gigantic chapel that oversees it, and there's Napoleon's tomb, and in 13 different cases that you can run. I mean, he is a hero, and he will remain a hero to the French for the end of time. So when we come back, we'll talk about what's Europe look like in 1850. At some level, it looks somewhat similar like before the revolution started, and in some ways, the borders may look somewhat similar. Although this will now be Belgium, Switzerland will now exist. The Holy Roman Empire is clearly gone, but it is nowhere near so. The ideology and the modern arguments that we still think about today are on the table and they don't change. So consider reading these two chapters. This is completely different stuff. And in some ways, this is maybe more important than the revolution itself. Some would argue, I would be inclined to at least partially agree, that this is more important altogether than all of the ideological stuff and the political stuff. This is the ability to turn fossil fuels into power and produce stuff to buy that that most of us don't need. And for a little while, the ability of the urban masses to still control events. And you could put up barricades and fight the forces of power to a draw. Sometimes they win, sometimes they would lose, but there was at least the possibility for a little while that you could pull it off. But this is the end of flame death. In 1830, they lose. So it's not the first one. They lose in 1848, they'll win, but they don't lose. And now, good luck. The urban mass is full of this thing. There's no way now. They just are fodder in a modern machine that doesn't give a shit of them. And they live in the homeless shelter. And we could tomorrow, if we truly care about our fellow man and take care of this issue. And most of everybody in this room does. So what's wrong with our politicians? What the hell is going on? Why is this not getting? We don't want to pay the taxes. Oh, Jesus. Why? Come on, we should give up our next vacation, which costs $15,000. What the hell? We so. I guess I'm angry here. Sorry. And that's when the Thomas Manifesto got really fun. Everyone get your pens out. He's going to say something. Shouldn't we be angry? I mean, this is unbelievable. And there are fellow human beings. I mean, what the hell? Isn't there a perception that it's not working, that this order, like the order in 1770, doesn't function anymore, that it's not going to work? And filling at the edges, a carbon tax is not going to work. The carbon tax will get us a little way there, but there's got to be some real dramatic change. And if you were back then, you would say, I don't think it'll happen. I'm just going to have sex, have babies, take drugs. I quit. I'm not that interested. Our fellow teachers in some schools say kids in school now are fragile. They're fragile as hell. They're on edge. Now, some of it is fake. Some of it is they're taking propaganda from outside. Well, you just said something that upset me very much, and I would like to not have to buy homework to them. So, well, but a lot of it is real. The epidemic of despair among our youth is pretty substantial, and it isn't just our youth. You've got to imagine girls in Afghanistan. So the enlightenment ideas still hang out there. It sounds like humanity got enough choice in a global climate in which everyone suffers equally, or maybe not equally. No, it's not true. We don't suffer. The poor suffer.
Yes.
The rich go to higher rank, and then they've got the money to do it. It's in South Dakota. All right, let's go home. Let's go home. Let's go home. The Dodgers loser. Anyone know? That's all.